Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College and Yeshiva University here in New York City. Noam Chomsky has argued for years that if an action is right or wrong for others, it's right or wrong for us. It's a variation of the golden rule and applies to everybody in their everyday actions, including nation states who should apply it to their domestic and foreign policies. By that standard, we're in a profound moment of spiritual decadence in the United States. Militarism abroad, gross wealth inequality at home, white supremacy, an escalating neo-fascist movement, ecological catastrophe looming, and ever-increasing possibilities of nuclear holocaust. Chomsky's principle is rooted in telling the truth across the board, whether it's Russian, American, Indian, or Hungarian gangsterism, whoever. A large part of the backlash and resistance to the principle has to do with the fact that the most powerful ideology in the modern world today is nationalism and the allegiance to the nation state, pitting one people against another, convincing them to live and die blindly for their nation state. Internationalists see it different. A Gazan baby is as precious as an Israeli one. A Ukrainian child is as precious as a Russian child. We need to create moral, political, intellectual alternatives to the intense, destructive, and powerful hyper-nationalism we see all around us. The international workers of the world, Mark Twain, Cornell West, Chris Hedges, Toni Morrison, Herman Melville, William Faulkner, William James, W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King, Ella Baker, are among those many in an American tradition that did confront the power of that nationalism and bore witness to international solidarity. That's what's needed now, more than ever. We're very pleased and excited to have Aziz Rana on the Radical Imagination for the first of hopefully many shows. Aziz is a professor of law at Cornell University and has been one of the most articulate and courageous scholars, researchers, and activists arguing for the creation of a transnational infrastructure of left forces across the world. Movements of the left need clear, strong, and coherent alternatives to the hardest questions of foreign policy crises, such as the Russian war in Ukraine. His research interests include American constitutional law and political development, and he's the author of The Two Faces of American Freedom. His forthcoming book, No Other Gods, Security, Citizenship, and the Victory of Constitutional Patriotism, examines how emerging constitutional veneration, especially in relation to national security imperatives, shape popular politics. We welcome him here to radically imagine and discuss a new left internationalism in the heart of empire. So Aziz, hi, it's so great to have you here. You're calling from Connecticut. I'm in New York, right? And
so I'm in upstate New York. I'm in.
So we're both in
we're the state of
the
New
Empire
York.
State.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yes.
That's the slogan, right? We're in the Empire State. But okay, seriously, it's great to have you on.
Thanks so much for having me on the show. I really appreciate it, and thank you for that lovely introduction.
Wonderful. Well, let's just dive in. Help our audience understand, what are the two faces of American freedom? How can we understand that?
Yeah, so the argument that I make in my first book, and it's really something that shapes a lot of my work, is that the U.S. from really the earliest days of its founding sort of best understood as a specific kind of experiment in what I call settler empire. In other words, it tied really rich internal accounts of freedom, participation, economic independence to membership, but it bound these to exclusionary and subordinating forms of power, in particular to a politics of conquest over indigenous lands, or the expropriation of indigenous land, and the use of hard but necessary work as a way of ensuring that insiders gain benefits. And this kind of hard, necessary work was especially the coerced labor of enslaved Black persons. And that's really the two faces, so that you have rich accounts of freedom, but accounts of freedom that are profoundly circumscribed. And they're circumscribed in many ways through this distinction between the internal and the external, or in the context of 20th century politics, between the domestic and the foreign, where those that are on the outside get certain kinds of benefits and those that are on the outside face really harsh forms of power. And it's one of the reasons why you can think of somebody like Trump as really maybe the most recent expression of perhaps the longest and most sustained political tradition in the US, which is a version of exclusionary populism. So an economic populism for those that are insiders, settlers, or white nationalists, but a form of near limitless coercive power over those that are on the outside looking in.
So there was, from the very beginning, a great skepticism, obviously, of mass democracy. And I mean, if you want to use psychiatric terms here, it sounds like very schizophrenic, very distorted, very dysfunctional, or at least for most people, correct? I mean, the system worked for some and paid lip service to certain Enlightenment ideals, but in actuality, it really wasn't what it was all made out to be for the great masses of people and workers, and of course, Blacks and indigenous people. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'd say is that I think it's really important to appreciate that not only was the U.S. sort of founded as a settler experiment, so as a sibling to, other colonies like South Africa and New Zealand and Canada, Australia, but that it also emerged in a pre-industrial moment during a time of agricultural development, where the most common political traditions really argued that for some to enjoy the benefits of things like economic independence, free land holding, that couldn't really be universal, that there would have to be people that engaged in hard forms of work. And this was something that was sort of an embedded part of even quote unquote Republican ideas in England, where there were basic assumptions that, regardless of race, there would have to be workers that participated in providing the conditions for some to be free. And that the way that specific problem, which is a kind of a problem connected to political ideology and agricultural production, was solved in the US was basically by racializing this distinction between insiders and outsiders. And it meant that in the early part of the American experience, there was a real debate within settler society between Republicans and Democrats, where the Republican ideology was connected to this sort of wariness of poor settlers being able to kind of enjoy political power through strong legislatures. And so this is why you have a constitutional system that's built on intense checks and balances that limit the power of the vote. And then you have poor settlers that want more majoritarian institutions so that they can engage in majority rule. But the thing that both of these sides agreed on, let's say more elite Republicans versus more sort of mass Democrats, is that the terms of who could be included was profoundly limited, that the society still rested on indigenous expropriation and various kinds of racial and gender exclusions. And so it means that really for large chunks of American history, the best way to think of the country is not in the liberal democratic terms that are most familiar, but instead as a kind of ethnically defined, racially circumscribed democracy, as a Herrenvolk or a white supremacist democracy, or in my language, a settler empire, because it's committed to providing these internal benefits through external territorial conquest.
What is the role of such things as the Protestant work ethic? How does that play in all this, in sort of a puritanical influence at that time?
Yeah, so
sort of a moral if you will, standing.
Yeah, so the initial colonists from England, many of those initial colonists were Protestants that
Right.
were religious dissenters. And it's one of the reasons why actually in the North American colonies and what becomes the US, you have a radicalized version of the Republican tradition that you might see in England. So there's a Republican tradition that emphasizes this idea of participation, economic independence, but it becomes much more intensified in the North American context. And it's how it joins to a spiritual argument, which is individuals can only be free if they have genuine control over all of the institutions that shape their own collective experience, whether those are economic and political or spiritual. That you have to read the text of the Bible, and you have to have a personal relationship with faith in God, and that you cannot rely on intermediaries like various kinds of church hierarchies. Now, that radical version of the Republican promise, unfortunately, in the context of North American colonization, becomes joined. The way that insiders engage in this is through various forms of extreme exclusion. And it becomes joined not only to the forms of exclusion that I described, but also to a virulent brand of anti-Catholicism, for example. So that in the late 18th century, in the context of the American Revolution, that one of the things that colonists were rebelling against was the fact that the British Empire, which had control over Quebec, was providing various kinds of toleration to people that were Catholic. And so there was a kind of intense anti-Catholicism. And so Protestantism both fuels the internal radical politics of the Republican project. It fuels various forms of exclusionary politics. But I will say one of the things that happens, and it also fuels, by the way, the focus on the text, the centrality of text like the Declaration and the Constitution to American identity. But one of the things that's really interesting as the 19th century proceeds is that in order simply to populate North America and to be able to kind of demographically control indigenous territory and enjoy the benefits of economic growth, you needed more people than just Anglo-Protestants from England.
Right.
And what that ends up doing is it creates a greater focus on a new category that starts to emerge, which is the category of white. Where rather than thinking of all of these different European communities as separate races, you have an amalgamation. This is the idea, in a way, of the nation of immigrants. This is sort of where it comes from, an amalgamation of all of these different European communities that are included as part of the project of settlement. But that inclusion ends up being bound to a rigid hierarchy that's now organized around terms of whiteness, effectively. So
and ethnicity,
So you can be Catholic and become American over time, but that Catholic inclusion is bound to the exclusion of Black people, Mexicans, Chinese, and others.
And we're pitted against each other. So this idea of this melting pot myth, in a way, is also coupled with, as you point out, manifest destiny of America. So you talk over and over again about the need to see connections between domestic politics and foreign politics as well. So how does that fit into the early periods here in America?
No, I think so. This is a really clear example, which is the story of American founding and of the 19th century is a story of continental expansion and conquest because of the centrality of land and the expropriation of indigenous land to the internal benefits of economic independence. And so that external expansionist project is directly tied. It's a precondition for the internal emancipatory aims. And it's why when you have folks today that are liberals that say, well, the problem in the US has been hypocrisy or competing values, where you have inclusive values, liberal values, egalitarian ones, and racial prejudices sort of fighting against each other. I think that fundamentally misunderstands the structural dynamics of American development, where these two things as a political matter really fuse together as a coherent ideology. The internally egalitarian emancipatory features were bound to an external project of power, that the domestic and the foreign were deeply interconnected. And it played out in ways that are quite surprising for, let's say, a contemporary American. So, for example, throughout most of the 19th century, the majority of states and territories in the US provided for non-citizen voting,
Mhm.
but for non-citizen voting by those that are European migrants. And the thought was that you needed European migrants to come to the US. So this is immigration policy as a hinge between the domestic and the foreign, in order to
Right.
be able to effectively settle, demographically transform and control indigenous land. But you didn't necessarily want to include populations that you viewed as quote unquote unfit or inappropriate for the settler project. And so you could have indigenous peoples
Right.
on the land for long periods of time, systematically denied rights, even after they were formally incorporated as citizens. Black Black persons that were not enslaved, but are formally free, that were citizens, and Mexicans after the Mexican-American War that were formerly citizens that had no voting rights, that faced systematic disenfranchisement. But you could have non-citizen Europeans with voting rights or access to Western land grants. And that's because your status as settler was effectively more important than your status as citizen during this period. And it ended up shaping the terms of how the external and the internal, the foreign and the domestic, were joined together.
And of course, that plays out today as well, as we see the use of immigrant labor, seasonal immigrant labor, and the way in which the Constitution, you've written so much on this as well. And I love the term that you have here. The Constitution has to be transcended rather than redeemed. And what do you mean by that? And what do you mean by the Constitution's collusion, in a sense, with this settler mentality, that philosophy that you're describing here?
So the Constitution was the federal Constitution, just in sort of bare bones terms, without getting into too much depth on this, was the
Right.
victory of those Republican elites, settler elites, against laboring masses. It was an infrastructure that was built to contain the voting power of poor and working class, effectively, white settlers. And this is through all of the various kinds of checks and balances that effectively fracture the one thing that poor people have as their material resource, which is the power of the vote. And it's why, that it was resisted in the 1780s by many poor farmers and workers in places like Massachusetts, where there'd been the Shays Rebellion against sort of the economic domination of elites, as well as the court system. Essentially, all of the places where the rebellion had been hot are the places that voted against the federal Constitution. And then in the late 19th, early 20th century, you had the rise, in the context of sustained class conflict, of an argument that the Constitution was a counter-revolutionary document. But the thing that ended up happening over time, and this is really, in my view, a 20th century story, is that constitutional order became wrapped up with a narrative that American elites, and then increasingly larger and larger publics, told to itself about what made the US special and why the US was actually genuinely worthy of global authority. That the country was the first anti-imperial break, it was the first state to really write a new constitution, and that it had a kind of modeler example that was worth replicating everywhere.
Right.
And what this has done over time is, I think, it's obscured not only the anti-democratic legacy of the constitutional system, but the ways in which that constitutional system facilitated in the power of enslavers pre-Civil War. It undermined Reconstruction in the years after the Civil War. That it pushed back against meaningful economic changes at the end of the 19th and the early part of the 20th century. And so we have a cultural account of the Constitution's role in collective life as the near ideal embodiment of liberal democracy that fundamentally disconnects from its historical effect, and means that we have an infrastructure that is profoundly inadequate for the actual ends today that we might want, especially those of equal and effective freedom for all.
Interesting. So before we get into the Cold War model too, should we also talk about the 1890s as the period when America really becomes a more traditional world empire.
Absolutely. So my own view about American history and political development is that the late 19th and the early 20th century is a profound historical hinge. It's a
Right.
moment in which the settler project is essentially completed. So this doesn't mean that indigenous peoples disappear. They continue to occupy the same landmass, engaged in the same projects of sovereign self-determination and resistance that we see all the way to the present, and provide a profound site for, in our own moment, thinking about what it would mean to genuinely transform American life. But as a matter of expansion, we have the effective completion of the project, and you have the rise of
In this country,
in this country, in the
So
U.S.
then we turn
Yeah,
elsewhere in the
and you
world,
have the rise of this really
imperialist.
internal class conflicts between workers and business elites. And it produces, I think, a really interesting moment, which is what feeds, for example, the IWW and the teens that you described, and the Socialist Party, a moment where you have more and more white settlers who come to recognize that the only way that they can actually overcome various forms of economic subordination is by altering their sense of community, breaking free from forms of settler and white solidarity,
Right.
and embracing what amounts to a kind of internationalism built on the shared material interests of all workers everywhere. And that's one model that's a real response to the circumstances of the time. But what ends up winning it instead,
If I may, as within an American experience and context, correct? How much do we borrow from the European socialists and Marxists?
well, I think, yeah, so one of the things that's really interesting about that internationalist moment, so this is a moment of political instability and openness, and what's going to emerge out of it is American global power,
Right.
and the kind of liberal capitalist hegemony that we're familiar with. But this is a moment of real openness. And possibility. One of the things that I think is totally fascinating about this period is the intense internationalism grounded in class solidarity that you see, that plays out in terms of building cross-racial bridges within organizations like the IWW. But even if you just read some of the socialist periodicals, like the International Socialist Review in the early decades of the 20th century,
Right.
they'll have a section in the periodical that's called World of Labor. And it'll be, well, what is it that the labor movement is doing in Germany, in England, but not just in Europe, in Japan, in Mexico, the Mexican Revolution, and the alternative constitutional frame that the Mexican Revolution ends up generating in 1917 is itself a profound moment of political energy that folks in the US are connecting with. And so there's both, cross-Atlantic connections with Europe in terms of thinking about how you can experiment with new forms of social democracy or democratic socialism. But then there's also a much richer sense of drawing from examples that we don't just associate with Anglo-Europe.
Yeah, as I hear you talking, you're channeling the mind and soul of Stanley Aronowitz, who I was my co-host. We founded the show together. He was on the very, very first show, and he talked so much about the need to create these alternative narratives and cultures, periodicals, music, and so on. And he was certainly raised within that tradition. I do want to go back again, just for 1 second, to the distortions, the incredible, insane distortions that we live under. I just did a show a couple of weeks ago with one of the, I'm actually doing another one, the lawyer for the Shinnecock Nation out here in Southampton, and who have been, among other things, protesting various issues on the reservation there, that included the desire to get free beach passes to Southampton beaches, which the town disallows them. Now, the irony, of course, is that this was all land that was owned by the Shinnecock, 3,500 acres. In fact, the frickin' National Open is played at the Shinnecock Golf Course, which, as I understand, also burial ground for many of the ancestors of the Shinnecock Nation. So you've got this incredible issue here of protest. Southampton officials for beach passes to go to the beaches that was stolen from them. I mean, it's just when it boggles your mind, and yet we don't hear about that, and we're unwilling, and we're unwilling to look at what we have done. It's so difficult for us as a country, as a culture, so many of us, to come to grips with that. We were much more comfortable being in a state of denial or distortion or whatever, as you're pointing out here. So why has this been so difficult to create this anti-imperialistic narrative that you're telling us about?
So I think that it connects to the way that that sense of real internal conflict ended up being resolved starting in the 1890s, which is that the experiment that really took off was the US's turn to the global stage. And you see this with the Spanish-Cuban-American War, with the control of the Philippines and Puerto Rico. And so there's a turn abroad as a way of claiming the same material and market benefits that expansion out west had claimed, but under a fundamentally new historical circumstance, which is the rise of an assertive, non-white global public that over the course of the first half of the 20th century is going to be pressing for decolonization. That the US is a late actor to the global stage. And what Americans do, American elites, is that they take the anti-slavery narrative that had marked Civil War politics, that the US stands for the principles of the Declaration of Independence, that all are equal, and that it has a redemptive national project. And it links it up to the global project of the US, that the US is not interested in empire. It's not motivated by a principle of imperialism.
It's saving the world.
Yeah. It's instead motivated by a principle of exporting constitutionalism, hence the centrality of the federal constitution, and democracy. And so its interests are the world's interests. And over the course of really the first half of the 20th century, including the two world wars, especially in World War II and a confrontation with Nazi Germany, this idea of the US's special global mission becomes a really central way that American elites come to understand themselves. And then it also spreads culturally, because it becomes, and this is Gunnar Myrdal, the Swedish sociologist's notion of the American creed, it becomes central to domestic reform narratives, especially domestic reform narratives tied to the traditional civil rights movement. And it combines as a really powerful account of nationalist narrative and myth, that the US is committed to democracy, constitutionalism, racial equality, a project of inclusion, and all of this gives it a kind of special right abroad, and that its right abroad to intervene everywhere is then reaffirmed whenever it engages in various kinds of inclusion at home. And by the time we get to the mid-20th century, not only is this so entrenched, it becomes so entrenched that the way that, let's say, Teddy Roosevelt would have understood the US as a kind of settler sibling to white South Africa is increasingly eliminated from cultural understanding. And that, no, the US is the very repudiation of that. It's a nation that is a creedal nation organized around principles of equality all the way from the founding. And so when indigenous activists or Black radicals in the 60s and 70s say, hey, the US is an instantiation of empire and needs its own moment of decolonization, there's a profound cultural disconnect between that argument and what has been instilled within Americans, including within liberal Americans who understand that the pathway to moral reform and improvement is by holding true, reaffirming this overarching narrative of the country.
Right.
And it's one of the reasons why even today in the foreign policy context, it's very, very difficult to get Americans to break from a bedrock commitment to American global primacy, because there's this sense that the US state is this exceptional state, and by necessity, it has this role to play as the backstop to a global order, and that without the US engaged in this role, that, the ends that are the world's ends that the US pursues of market capitalism and democratic constitutionalism are all going to collapse.
Would even be more chaotic.
Yeah.
Right. So this is what you're referring to in terms of your idea of creedalism, correct? And veneration
Yeah.
of the American project. Now, so you mentioned the 60s. Let's probably move the new left. How does that fit into this? The
The new
Hanoi
left,
Jane and Jane Fonda sitting on top of a tank and ho ho ho, Ho Chi Minh will win and so on. How did that play out?
So, I think that is a really
Vietnam War.
significant moment, and it's absolutely tied to the Vietnam War, because
Right.
the logic of the Cold War that was really entrenched in this idea of the specialness of the American project is
Right.
based on this thought that, well, okay, the US sometimes has to step outside the rules that it itself establishes, but that's to make sure that the international rules are followed. But then you have, at that point, 25 years of, well, what is that actually meant in practice? The US is continuously engaged in rule defection on behalf of corporate and military elites in ways that subvert the self-determination of anti-colonial forces abroad. And all of that comes to a head with Vietnam, both because of the sheer brutality of the war in Vietnam, but then also because of the draft, where you have, a massive draft of Americans that are going to fight in a war that's increasingly unpopular, and that then exposes these broad issues about the very nature of the US Cold War project. And then that combines that sort of that anti-war sentiment that is open to contesting not just the specifics of the war in Vietnam, but of the entire Cold War project, combines with a new Black radicalism, where you've had the achievements of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, but you still have sustained generational Black poverty that connects race and class in ways that are not altered by liberal legal improvements. And that produces all of these new Black radical organizations, including, of course,
Panthers.
the Panthers, but not just the Panthers. It's the turn of SNCC, it's Drum and James and Grace Lee Boggs. And so the anti-war position combined with the Black radical position that's also centrally concerned with the war, linked together in a context in which globally you have new third world internationalist movements, and that you have these thick third world movements and organizations that are making the argument that the world should be stitched together around anti-colonial alliances regardless of nationality, that your alliance is not with a powerful co-national who might be a business elite in the US or in, let's say places in Africa and Asia, part of a ruling class that's tied to the old imperial elite. It has to be one that connects all of these different colonized peoples and working peoples around the world, that links internationalism and socialism. And so it produces, I think, this really powerful moment. It's a moment that in the US is crystallized by the August 68 Democratic National Convention, where the majority of Democratic primary voters vote for anti-war candidates. The person that's then given the nomination is Humphrey, who didn't even run in the primary. Yep. And protesters are being beaten in the streets while the Democratic Party is backing a pro-war platform. And it creates a moment where it seems like a new anti-imperial politics of radicalism has a chance to really claim the center stage in the US. But yes, for a variety of reasons, and I think probably the most significant is really the long-term conservative turn of the American white middle and working class.
Counter movement.
Yeah, as a function of the post-war settlement, but also a variety of other forces. There's always a constraint on the capacity of that anti-imperial politics to really claim center stage. And then when it dissipates and collapses because of external violence, but then also internal limitations, the only reform language that's left on the table in the US is the language of liberal exceptionalism. What was wrong about Vietnam was that it was an era of an otherwise moral nation. The way that you get change in this country is by reaffirming nationalist tropes, reaffirming market capitalism, racial ameliorism, but working within the accepted terms of the system.
And a more efficient group of experts, particularly security experts, who will be able to do better than we have. And let me just add too, certainly there were some excesses, right? And craziness in the left that we've had Mark Rudd on the show a few times. And Mark admits, I mean, he was off there in La La Land thinking he and a few others were Che Guevara and would be taking off to the hills with a few rifles and create the revolution. And also, wouldn't you say, Aziz, the corruption of some of the leaders also in these third world countries certainly didn't help, correct?
So I think this is one of the things I think is really important for the present, which is one of the weaknesses about left foreign policy in particular, but I think left movements generally, is that there's no sense of transnational possibility, that left politics tends to be contained within the national borders. And in a way, we've lost something that we're not even aware that we lost, especially for people, my age and younger. And that period in the late 60s and early 70s and through the 70s was one in which you did have these really thick transnational connections. Yeah. And you understood the left in global terms. But there was a structural weakness, both domestically in the US and at the global level. Domestically in the US, unfortunately, the new left that you're describing, that formation, was not similarly situated to socialist labor activists in the early 20th century, to things like the Socialist Party, where you could make an argument that there was a possibility that through electoral means, institutional means, you could actually win majority elections.
They had given up on that. Many had given up.
1936, the labor infuses the Democratic Party. Whatever you think about the co-optation of the Democratic Party of the labor movement then or later, that is an example of mass popular political power. And the limitation that the New Left faced in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and the Panthers faced in particular, was there was no pathway to majoritarian support. And without a pathway to majoritarian support, it fed two tendencies. One, a very small group of people went off into kind of violent fantasies that were deeply destructive. But then a number of those activists ended up retreating effectively into the provision of community service programs, into kind of local politics. But you couldn't have a mass national movement that could claim national power. And then at the international level, that when independence came, a number of third world leaders became autocrats in their own right. And then there was also the structural limitations of, even if you had great programmatic ideas like the new international economic order that was pressed throughout the 1970s by Julius Nyerere or Michael Manley, you were dealing with a global capitalist order framed around American dollar hegemony, American market dictates, and a set of international financial institutions that were largely impervious to these ideas. And so it's, I think, a really important intellectual moment to remember as part of the collective history of the left in our own contemporary memory, but it's also important to recognize these limitations.
And what I like so much, among so many other things I like in terms of what you've been arguing and writing about, is your emphasis on new institutional structures. Tell me a little bit about what you have in mind there. Yeah. Because it has to be structured. It has to transcend individuals here, obviously. And again, as I quoted Chomsky, I mean, we're talking about the need to create structures that are going to be appealing to leaders around the world, and many of which are not going to be open to it either.
Yeah, no,
absolutely. So what are we dealing with here? What are we working with today? Present day structures. What are some of the groups you could point out for our audience to?
Yeah. So I'd say that the problem, I think that you see this especially in the foreign policy domain, is that domestically, when we think about, well, how to get racial justice or move away from capitalism toward a much more emancipatory economic system, there's a long-standing conversation about power building. Well, we need to actually build institutional power in communities that are traditionally oppressed and marginalized so that they have the capacity to, through various kinds of reform levers, make the daily reproduction of the existing status quo harder. And so that is a kind of familiar way of thinking about domestic politics. But when we think about foreign politics, foreign affairs, it's about the conversation is almost always about national security experts and elites that are engaged in grand strategy among competing nation states, unipolarity versus multipolarity, which interests are in the national interest. And this is an expert's game. It's only not an expert's game, frankly, like Vietnam or the Iraq War, where when the US has significant boots on the ground, and then that becomes a site of mass mobilization. And one of the things that I argue, which is that we have to return to a left imagination that's like the imagination in the 70s with Third World Internationalism or Workers' Internationalism, the early part of the 20th century, that understands the foreign as also a site of power building, and that global relations of capital and empire as the water within which any political currents swim. And so that means thinking really seriously about, well, how can you have strong institutions transnationally that connect left elements? And the three that I really emphasize are, one, there needs to be a programmatic effort to rebuild the position of global labor. And that can be done by pressing for basic transformations in corporate property rights, as well as extensive labor protections. When labor is strong, both domestically and globally, historically, that's when you have a context in which the left can succeed. The second, I think it's really important, just as in, if we're thinking about the long history of the US, to decriminalize the border, to provide extensive immigrant rights, because immigrants are a significant part of the American working class, providing the essential work today, just as historically subordinated workers did in the past, and that there are also a clear site of transnational connection between working classes in the US and working classes elsewhere, especially, for example, in Mexico, Central and Latin America. And then the third thing is to really push to demobilize substantially the national security state through a defunding project that's then pegged concretely to economic, the social democratic agendas, housing, healthcare, job access,
and mass incarceration, the drug war.
Because that's a way of showing how what the elites do actually have an impact on movements. And I should say that there are groups now that are doing some of this work.
Tell us.
Yeah, so I think the Progressive International, which is sort of connected to Varoufakis and Bernie Sanders' ideas of attempting to build links across borders, is an organization that is centrally organized around this project. How can you strengthen these alliances across borders of the left? And then I also think, even if less institutionally framed, the work, for example, of the Movement for Black Lives in constructing the experience of Black subordination as a global story of racism and colonialism is really important. So that, it was telling to me that a year ago, when you had sort of like the events that took place in Gaza, that there was kind of a shifting popular consciousness about it in the US, about Palestinian rights. And I think that was substantially because of how the Movement for Black Lives and various kinds of Black racial justice activists had framed and articulated the position of Palestinian self-determination as itself connected to these basic questions of race. And so we can see this. There's, there's a variety of other global grassroots and social justice organizations as well. And their work needs to be sustained and built upon. And it's also important not just for the long term, but it's important in the context of every time there's a quote unquote global security hotspot, something happens around the world. And this could be Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, the Russia's imperial invasion and violation of Ukrainian self-determination. The national security state, the US national security state, has a clear response and agenda built around its own interests that use the same basic militarized toolkit, that engage with the same set of security allies, whether it's Macron or Merkel or whomever else. And the left, precisely because it doesn't have these transnational institutions, has no response effectively. And American leftists, including myself, we don't have any connections.
Nowhere to go.
We also don't have connections to people on the left in those specific countries.
Right.
So that there's, before the event, there's no sustained conversation between an American left and, let's say, a Ukrainian left, so that there's an idea of how to think about alternative frames for a country like the US intervening or engaging.
Well, I knew this from my opening, and I hope you'll agree. I knew that this was not going to possibly be done in one show. So I have question upon question. In the remaining few minutes, it's not going to be fair on you. I'm going to throw a bunch of stuff. What is your take on it seems like Reverend Barber and the Poor People's Campaign has been able to touch on, many of the issues that you're talking about too, the connection between, in the King tradition too, that we need to have a freedom budget and so on. Also, what about the use of dissensus politics that Cloward and Piven developed in terms of pushing for more disruption rather than concentrate, although certainly that's part of it too, electoral politics. And again, hasn't the left missed a lot when it's not really dealt with some of this struggle through moral and spiritual lens? And the final thing I'll throw on here, and you have a minute and a half to answer. No, I'm teasing. Actually, I'm not teasing about that. The time. Should it be put upon Israel as a country, as sort of the litmus test for left and progressive approval? Or is it possible to understand colonial ventures from the side of people who also feel threatened? Because the Israelis, for better or worse, also feel threatened in a hostile environment. And so it's not just one group of people versus another. And we need to start pitting one against each other. And I understand the oppression that's going on there, but also there's great fear of the other within Israeli culture. And how do you deal with that? Because it's displaced, it's distorted, but there is a reality to it as well. So, okay.
Yeah, so there's.
I'm sorry to throw this all at you at the last minute here, but it's actually, I planned this so we would do another show.
Yeah, no, I mean, so I think there's a lot of great questions there. So the first thing is I absolutely think that what Reverend Barber is doing is absolutely in the example or the tradition of what I'd like to see just spread further. And, there's one of the things that I think has been really remarkable about now going on the last decade, especially since 2014, 2015 in the US, is just the revival of left imagination, thinking, ideas, organization, activism. It's the period in my life, for all the ways in which these have been such destructive years, that, the left has been most vibrant and essential that I can remember. And so we can talk about, Jackson, Mississippi. We can talk about the Bernie Sanders campaigns, the Fight for 15, and on and on and on. And I think all of this is really part of restitching a left political base and memory that had been fundamentally cleaved and broken by the Cold War, and then by the kind of post-Cold War 1989 national self-congratulation that just sort of supercharged American exceptionalist ideas. So there's lots of ways in which I think this is a really hopeful moment, actually, to be somebody engaged in left politics. On Piven and Cloward, my own view is that you need both extra institutional and you need institutional. And the reason why I emphasize the institutional is because the left is actually now strongest when it comes to extra institutional power. You can see this in, the number of people that came out to the George Floyd protests and lots of different examples. But part of the story is also a left that had been systematically excluded and eliminated from the traditional houses of political power, from electoral politics, from the traditional labor movement. And so alongside extra institutional strength, it's really important to kind of rebuild the institutional. Both to me go hand in hand, in that you can't succeed with one and not the other. On the spiritual, I feel like this connects to a bigger issue, which is that there's one of the effects of the deinstitutionalization of the left is the way in which left ideas is sort of removed from how many people, and frankly, especially white working class folks with the decline of the labor movement, just understood their day-to-day lives, like who people interact with, what kinds of communities they share, what institutions are present, who you're in conversation with. And all of that creates a kind of received culture in the present. This is what Lawrence Goodwin, historian of populists, talked about, the kind of hierarchies that are established. A received culture that defines what counts as solidarity, what arguments are acceptable arguments, what ways of talking are acceptable ways of talking. And that, in a way, one of the things that the left has to do is to move from that received culture to a movement culture by rebuilding these institutions that give people a sense of purpose, meaning, and allow them to kind of live their lives through them. So
Absolutely.
that you have these spaces where people can find not just self-worth, but friendship, community, solidarity through collective action. And so that it's not just at election time when a left liberal says to somebody, you should vote your interests because the Republicans don't back your economic interests. It's a daily experience of understanding how shared economic interest is tied to a shared world that has spiritual meaning.
And we are truly brothers and sisters and comrades. Yeah. And as my comrade, we're going to have to, we're way over. We didn't touch on Israel. And
yeah, so, I mean, the thing I would say there is that,
yeah,
it reminds me of the conversation that we have to have in the U.S., which is the U.S. has a colonial history, and we have to think really seriously about what decolonization in our specific context would mean.
Yeah, and they need to have that within their
community. And that's the same kind of conversation that has to take place.
Agreed.
How is it that you actually construct a different kind of polity and sense of solidarity and community?
The Zionist dream is not what it's turned out to be in Israel. I think most Israelis would even agree with that. Aziz, gotta go. This is wonderful. Thank you so very much. It was really great. I enjoyed so much meeting you, and I hope to see you again very, very soon on The Radical Imagination. Thank you again.
My pleasure too.
All right. Take care, my brother. Bye. And thank you so very, very much. This is Jim Vrettos. We'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.